I'm Lenora Chu, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Lenora Chu.
It's episode 246 of the Author Stories Podcast. I'd like to thank some sponsors today before we get into today's awesome interview. If you would like to sponsor the show and highlight your product or service to our audience, go to hankgarner.com and click on the advertise link in the top menu. Thanks to Daniel Arthur Smith and Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. This 19th issue of Tales from the Canyons of the Damned consists of 5 sharp, suspenseful, thought-provoking short stories, each from a different featured master of speculative fiction. Pick up the Halloween edition today. The Future Chronicles by curator and publisher Samuel Peralta. The Future Chronicles has grown from a single collection of robot stories into a series whose unique take on major science fiction and fantasy themes, AI, aliens, time travel, dragons, telepaths, zombies, immortality, galactic battles, cyborgs, doomsday, has made it one of the most acclaimed short story anthology series of the digital era. Pick up something from the Future Chronicles today. ThirdScribe is a web platform built to serve all members of the book community, readers, authors, and publishers. ThirdScribe can help you get the most out of your publishing and reading experience. Connecting readers and writers, give ThirdScribe.com a look today. From Book 1 of the Paragons Trilogy by C. Stephen Manley, When Dark Portals Open, Heroes Will Awaken. Israel Trent is a man living his dream as a crime reporter for the Chicago Tribune. Erin Sims is a young woman whose life is a blur of neon lights, drug-fueled diversions, and being in the wrong places with the wrong people. These two strangers wake up together in a modern-day dungeon with no memory of how they got there and come face-to-face with monsters that neither ever dreamed existed. Rescued by agents of the mysterious Sentry Group, the duo soon find their lives turned upside down. Awaken is the first book of the Paragons Trilogy. It's a gripping origin story filled with mystery, fast-paced action, horrific threats, and bewildering fringe science. If you enjoy an action thriller with a heavy dose of the fantastic, you'll love C. Stephen Manley's Awakened. Essence, Book 1, Septima, series by Nick Breaker. Troy, with his irrational fears, is the least likely person to lead a war, but that doesn't mean he can escape his destiny. A trip to New Orleans turns into something much larger when aliens kidnap him and his friends. A perfect doppelganger for their dead General Tomaz, Troy is thrust into the front lines of battle against Reptaran invaders. As he struggles to maintain control of his own destiny, Troy knows that no matter the outcome, his life will never be the same. Explore the mind of this unlikely hero in Essence, the first book in a new sci-fi series by Nick Breaker, a coming-of-age tale full of adventure and steamy encounters. Pick up Essence, Book 1 by Nick Breaker today. Music City Macabre by Bob Williams is some of the best action, adventure, horror you'll ever read. Music City will never be the same as you have a front row seat for the end of the world. Give this series a look today. Music City Macabre by Bob Williams. Right before we get into today's awesome interview, we're going to pause for just a minute for the Keystroke Media Minute. My friends at Keystroke Medium have put together a series of little short snippets that I think will help you with writing and publishing. Right after that, we're going to get into our great interview, and then after that, stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series.
Hey everybody, it's Josh Hayes, and I'm here with Chuck Manley and Scott Moon. We are Keystroke Medium, and this is the Keystroke Medium Minute. Hey guys, Josh here. I'm here with Chuck and Scott. And today, the Keystroke Minute is picking your genre and why you should stick to one. So there's a lot of talk on indie circles about when you're getting started, you should pick one genre. And so today we're going to talk about why that benefits you as a writer. Chuck, if you want to start out.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a mistake I made with my first series. My first series was a mashup of horror and superhero novels and urban fantasy. And the reason you want to pick an established genre and learn the tropes associated with that genre is because two very important reasons, I think, is that one, that way you know where to categorize it. Amazon knows where to categorize it, and the readers will know where to go to look for it. And B, when they find it, they know pretty much they're getting what they went looking for. So, while mashups are a lot of fun and they're a lot of fun to write and read, I think if you're really starting out and you want to get some sales under your belt, you need to stick to what's established just for the sake of building enough work that you can eventually do the mashups that you want to do.
Right. And Scott, I don't know if you want to talk about jumping between genres when you're starting and how that can kind of slow down the audience building.
Right. And I think that's really important. So my first thing I'd like to talk about on this subject is that you have to pick a genre that you truly like, you truly love, so that you can spend the time in it and know it. So that's the big thing. Don't pick a genre because you think it sells well. Pick something you love, write that. As far as building your audience through that, if you're skipping back and forth, you got reader expectations. In my experience, your readers aren't always going to follow you back and forth. So you're going to have two distinct groups of readers, one for each genre generally. So pick something you really like, know it, love it, write it, and that will serve you probably better than just writing whatever you feel like that day.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if you look at a lot of writers here, when this indie revolution kind of took off, they kind of picked a genre that they liked. They wrote a book that did really well, and then they said, I really like this other story that I have in my head, and so I want to do that. And that second book didn't do as well because they established their brand kind of in that first book. And it's kind of like an actor getting kind of pigeonholed into a role. And but I think it is possible to write in separate genres, but I think when you're first starting out, if you don't have a history of work to build on I think that's sticking with military sci-fi or epic fantasy or urban fantasy is really, really the way to go in today's market.
Right, because you want to go with something that there's an established audience already there. I mean, that's really the bottom line.
Yep.
Absolutely. Okay, well, this has been Josh for Chuck and Scott. Thanks for listening to this Keystroke Minute. You can find more of our show at keystrokemedium.com, where we have author interviews and craft discussion and a lot of shenanigans. Come out and hang out with us.
Shenanigans.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm excited to have Lenora Chu on the show. Her new book is called Little Soldiers, An American Boy, a Chinese School, and the Global Race to Achieve. And Lenora joins us from a Starbucks in Chicago. Welcome, Lenora.
Hi, Hank. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me. Lenora, I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
You know what? I remember being in college, and I was working I was studying engineering, mostly because I had these very fierce tiger parents, and that's what they wanted me to do. But I was always more interested in working for the Stanford Daily, in participating in drama, and I did lots of plays. So I was always more interested in sort of creative expression than actually sitting in a laboratory engineering reservoirs and dams. So I had this conflict from a very early age.
There's a recurring thread in the podcast of writers that, were theater geeks or, had this acting bug, that those things run hand in hand in so many people.
I just felt like I had things to say and I wasn't finding outlets for them. And I was a very frustrated, artist, because it took me about, 5-10 years, well into my 20s, until I really started to, have the courage to find outlets. It took a little while.
So were you an active reader when you were younger?
I was. And, I started really in the news when I was 8 or 9 years old. I was reading Reader's Digest, Newsweek, Time Magazine. These were the things that came, I was just waiting for them to show up in my mailbox every single day. Wrinkle in Time. My mom was an avid reader. She was actually a chemistry professor, but she loved to read English literature. And so she really brought books into my life from a very early age. Of course, she never, encouraged me to pursue it as a profession. She sort of thought there wasn't a lot of financial stability to it. But she did bring books into my life from a very early age, and I have her to thank her, for that.
it's really interesting that you like to read the news and current events and things like that. What was it about that intrigued you? Was it just like a window into the rest of the world? A way to see outside of your narrow purview, or what do you think it was?
I think so. And that's what writing does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It transports you someplace else. And I had this very sort of high pressured environment. It was a nice childhood. We never really wanted for anything. It was suburban Houston, a good school district, but I was constantly being asked to study. This is a very typical Asian American experience, I would say, especially if you have a mom who's a chemistry professor and a father who's an engineer. It was always about math and science. And I'm like, no, that's great, because I think it brought a lot of discipline to my art in later years, just being able to sit down. And that's a big part of being a writer, isn't it? Being able to sit down and focus. And I think I learned that from my parents. Unfortunately, they wanted me to transfer that energy into subjects I wasn't ultimately interested in. But I learned a lot of that early discipline. And the writing and the reading and the books really transported me elsewhere to a much more exciting place, than I found in my sort of Houston suburban childhood. And it was an escape, I would say.
You said that you really wanted to write for the Stanford Daily.
I did.
What was it about that kind of ingrained itself in you?
Yeah, and I spent the first 10, 15 years, I still am a journalist. I consider myself both a journalist and an author.
Yeah.
And it was just the vitality of the newsroom, just walking into, and newsrooms across America are sort of in decline. But, back then you'd walk into the newsroom and there are people gathering around desks talking about ideas, about what's happening in the world. How do you best tell this story? And let's see if I can come up with something specific. I can't even remember what my first story was, but I just really idolized these sort of, seniors when I was a freshman, and how they were able to tell a story in a way that would grip you from the start. This is really old school journalism, but I just love the energy around it. And in some ways it's hard because as an author, my editor at HarperCollins actually had to tell me to stop reporting. This is a work of nonfiction narrative, Little Soldiers. And I began to get so engrossed in the lives of these other characters. One main character is my son. And, I see him every day. That was easy. But then I began to follow these other kids, these teenagers, two in Shanghai and one in the countryside. And I just, for years, I followed them. My editor at one point said, Lenora, when are you going to start writing? And to me, that was the hardest part, is to transition the energy of being out there and talking to people, and then having to take all of that and sit in a room and get it down on the page. So I think that's the challenge for a lot of journalists, in some ways, who write nonfiction.
Journalism is one of those careers that has the potential to be just like you see in the movies. Like if you see a courtroom drama movie, a lot of people are like, well, I would love to be a lawyer because you get to go into the courtroom and do battle every day. And
right.
the reality is that's not what lawyers do 90% of the time. There's
That's
lots
right.
of paperwork and research and all of that stuff. But if you're a journalist, you get to show up to work every day and you get to find a story to uncover and to tell the world. And, that's one of the few careers that's kind of just like you imagine it.
I would think so. It was really, really fun. It was great. I covered politics my first few years as a journalist, actually. But I would have to say I don't know if you remember Jesse the Body Ventura. He was the governor of Minnesota, and I was a State House reporter. And so I interviewed him a couple times. Wow, that was fun. You have a celebrity politician, and he was, smarter than people really gave him credit for. But those are some good times. But then on the flip side, there's the city council meeting. Let's discuss whether to put a roundabout in this tiny town in Maplewood, snore, so that, there's glory and there's also, drudgery, I would say.
Yeah. But you get to decide, how to tell that story. And sometimes there's just not a lot of story to tell, but
right. Exactly.
Like the
it's a great job.
Yeah. So, the book, Little Soldiers, it opens up, and, literally grabs you from page one, because it's really witty and funny. And I know it's it's a really serious, dense topic that you're tackling in this book. But nonfiction narrative is a great way to put it, because it's literally a page turner, and you discover things in the book you didn't expect to discover, and so before we get too far along, where did the idea for this book come from?
It's funny. I had spent, as someone pursuing the creative arts, I had spent about 5 or 6 years in Hollywood pursuing acting and writing. And all of a sudden in 2010, we had an opportunity to move to China. My husband is a journalist, and he reports for NPR at the moment. He covers China for NPR. But we moved to China for that reason. And I was still dead set on bringing this Hollywood memoir to life. Then, as a parent, I had my son enrolled in the Chinese state-run system, and all these things began to happen. And sort of my focus shifted. Here we are, Americans in basically the world's largest country that's becoming more competitive on every front, including education. And, when I looked at my son, a character in this book is Teacher Chen, and Teacher Chen and I clash on pretty much everything. Should my son have to eat eggs? Son have to lie still at nap time when he's outgrown his nap? Where should we put his asthma inhaler? And, as I was working on this Hollywood memoir, which is really set in Los Angeles, an ocean away, all of these interesting things began to happen with my son in this really draconian, authoritarian Chinese school system. And I knew that this was the story that just sort of organically unfolded. And I knew I had a book topic, especially because everyone was so focused on China as this sort of newfound global superpower. Is that really the truth? Or does China have some problems of its own?
Right. So what brought you guys to China? You say your husband is a journalist as well, but that's not a decision that most people are faced with, whether to go to China or not.
Yeah, the funny thing is, my parents are Chinese immigrants to America, and their families fled in the 40s and 50s. And so, came to America in pursuit of a better life. And then they raised their Chinese American daughter in a very nice suburb of Houston. Then I tell them, well, actually, I'm moving back to China. And my dad said something like, you can't drink the tap water there. We fled that country during times of war. It just didn't make any sense to him. And so it was very counterintuitive that this, American family would move back to China. And, but my husband had spent some time in the Peace Corps in China. And so he really saw the country in a very different way from my parents, and just found it fascinating. And it is a fascinating place, and I consider it my job to explain this sort of massive country to an American audience.
Is your husband Chinese American as well?
No, he's blonde haired, blue eyed from small town Minnesota, which is, it's very funny. Yeah.
So he has none of the baggage that
no
that you or your parents may have had.
Exactly. Right. And he can see it in a more academic way. I look at China with, fear and revulsion, as well as a little bit of pride, for what it's sort of become. So.
Yeah, it's our heritage is such a weird thing because we have no say-so in where we're from or, who brought us here. But there are these weird connections that we have with it and a certain responsibility too. It's such a bizarre thing when you think about it, really.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? And somebody said to me, only a woman of two worlds could have written this book, because I have an understanding of China in a way that, it helps to be Chinese. And then, of course, I came up through American public school, so I had that experience as well. And I think it hopefully brings a richness to the narrative.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, I'm a Gen Xer, and I think the year I graduated from high school is the year of the Tiananmen Square uprising. And I think, that makes a very profound impression on the way people see a country like China. What is happening in China now that makes it so much different than that image that I have of China?
Well, that's where the fear and revulsion comes from. When I talk to people who remember that era, and part of the book is about the positives to the Chinese way of education. There are some things that they do right, like the respect for the teacher, belief that every child can learn. I talk about this, and then someone always brings up, but what about Tiananmen? What about China's devastating human rights record? And yes, these are horrific things, and it's hard, I think, for people of a certain generation to separate the two, because China is a place of cognitive dissonance. There's some horrific aspects to this developing country in the way that it's run by the Communist Party, but there are also some positives to the culture. And I think the average American has a hard time separating the two, because the news media narratives are so negative, frankly. Yeah. And Tiananmen was so horrible, really.
Yeah. So. And we have this weird, prejudice system that we see a horrific act and we immediately imprint that on the society as a whole. Yeah. And that's unfair to the Chinese people for sure. But to, the Chinese system that's evolving and growing. And, I guess that's just a human thing though.
Yeah, I think it's human nature to judge, especially when you sort of have this sort of East versus West that's propagated, in the news media. It has gotten worse if you think about it. In this Trump era, it's like we almost have to assign a judgment to everything. But, my book is very balanced and nuanced, and I found that the media narratives around it will swing wildly, all good or all bad. This sort of nuance doesn't really sell, and it's a more complicated message. And in this sort of era of short attention spans, it's much easier to go one way or another. So
yeah. When you guys decided to move to China, what were your greatest hopes that you would experience there? What of the good of China and Chinese culture did you hope would seep into your family and that you would get to experience?
Yeah, I think it is, the Chinese really value family. And, I would say that I've grown closer to my parents in some way, just because I understand sort of where they came from and a little bit better. And they're so American now. They've been here for, 50 years, that when my dad comes over to visit us in Shanghai, he's getting ripped off by the street vendor. He doesn't know how to hail a taxi, so in some ways he's sort of, the lost American back in his home country that he left really when he was 2 years old. But of course he still speaks the language, but it's just, China's changing so rapidly. It's just it's so important to understand that even the Chinese are grappling with all of the social and economic change. And the things that they're holding on to are the positives of the culture, family, the importance of education. And I feel that my son, who's 9 now, has absorbed that just from having grown up in China and going through the Chinese school system. So.
Your son was 3 when he started in the school system there, is that right?
He sure was. Yeah.
Yeah. What was, well, first off, when the book opens, he's going through these experiences and you notice, that he is, changing, in front of you and becoming extreme, not that he was, ill behaved. I don't mean it like that, but, there were things that you noticed, and, there's this really funny, part where your husband and you were like, are your human rights being violated? Because he doesn't want to talk at the dinner table. And, I laughed out loud when I read that because, I took it in the spirit that you wrote it, I think. But what were your fears, in starting him in school there?
Well, yeah. So Teacher Chen in the book, I remember her teeth because Teacher Chen never smiled. And when I saw her teeth, I knew it was a grimace, and the grimace was usually for me, right? I was really the bane of her existence because I was constantly questioning her. And you do not question a Chinese teacher. They're really not used to having their authority challenged. So, my son would say things like, oh, Teacher Chen forced me to eat eggs, or Teacher Chen said that if I didn't nap, the police would take me away. It was just, there's like a threat-based fear to the culture that they use in the classroom. And I really struggled with that. And another time, they also use rewards in the classroom. So my son got a star. This is the scene you're talking about, a red star pasted to his forehead for sitting still. And he wouldn't take off the darn star. I'm like, I'm battling with Teacher Chen over my son's mind, And these were all the early fears that I had as a new, not only was I an American parent in China, I was also a new parent. This is my firstborn son. And I really wanted to find out what was happening in that classroom, So a lot of anxiety in the beginning,
right?
Which pretty much launched this investigation. What is happening in that classroom? Do I really have something to be worried about? Or, are they doing a few things right that we might be able to benefit from? The fear and the shaming aside, obviously. So.
Were you writing when you moved to China? Were you still doing freelance work or anything like that?
Yeah, I was. I had some clients. I used to run the alumni magazine out of one of the schools at the University of Southern California. I was also freelancing for Science and the Christian Science Monitor and various sort of journalistic clients. And then I was working on this book when I had time. First the Hollywood book, and then this book on Chinese education. I had a lot going on, and it was really hard. At one point, I realized I'm going to have to let everything go but the book. Otherwise, the book was never going to get written. And when friends asked me, how did you get your book done? I had to say that it's like singular focus. For me, I couldn't do it any other way. So,
what was the other book you were writing? You said you were writing a Hollywood memoir?
Yeah, it was called... It was basically my 5 or 6 years trying to work as an actor and a writer in Hollywood, and all the funny things that happen, when you show up to a casting call. And I shopped it around to a couple of agents, and I got a few nibbles, but it was sort of an uphill battle because people had felt the Hollywood book had been done, and there was such an interest in celebrity culture, and I wasn't a celebrity, even though the writing was great. And so I was actually reworking the proposal to bring it back to market when we moved to China. And then, of course, my attention got diverted to this topic. And when I brought this proposal to market, I mean, the response was robust. And I think it was the combination of it's so hard to have access to this school system. It just everything sort of lined up in a way that it wasn't for the Hollywood memoir. And I knew I had a good project. So.
Right. When writing a book like this, what really makes an engaging memoir or, narrative nonfiction, which is really memoir when it's about you, you really need an engaging storyline that runs through because just, reporting on the everyday affair, can get boring. But how do you pick out the narrative thread that is going to engage readers? Like, I guess what I'm asking is, at what point do you know, okay, this is the story, this is what the book is about, as you're digging through all the stuff?
It's funny. It was so organic, and I wish there were an easy answer, but I really just wanted to make sure my son was okay. And then not only that, the Chinese really produce what people say are the world's best students. So I had my son hating school, but then I look in the media narratives and I hear people praising the Chinese. And I knew somewhere in between those two narratives was the answer. And I wanted to find out, is there anything we can learn about parenting and education that would help not only my family, but maybe the readers of this book, maybe America, And that was really just this quest to unravel that question was really what drove it. And I wanted to keep it light because these are really heavy questions,
Exactly.
Being a student, academic achievement, this global competitiveness. And I wanted to keep it light. And the way you do that is through characters and through storytelling and anecdotes. And, I made sure to weave a funny story with, a heavily researched section. So if you don't have that sort of back and forth, I think you lose the reader. And the other thing is if it's all light, then you don't necessarily learn anything. But if it's all heavy, your reader doesn't get through the book. So I was really, when I was trying to piece this together, I really wanted to strike the balance between the two.
Yeah. Did the school system or the administrators or anyone know that you were tackling this subject?
Not really. No.
Did you feel like you were undercover a little bit?
A little bit. I was a journalist, inside basically the world's largest authoritarian state. And it was not without fear, especially because, I was constantly clashing with the teachers and the administrators. I wasn't going to say, hey, by the way, I'm writing about you, and I was a responsible journalist. I disguised identities where I felt, people's privacy was being compromised. And I'm pretty sure by now they actually know about the book. And I've had some offers to publish it inside China. So I think all is forgiven now.
And you guys still live there, don't you?
We do. Yeah, my son is still in the school system. He's 9 now. So when the action of the book starts, he's 3, and 6 years later, he's in 3rd grade now and doing wonderfully.
Yeah. Now you said that you, as a child, were pressed kind of hard by your parents to be to do good academically and to study, and you were looking for ways to express yourself artistically because you were an artistic kid, or had that expression that wanted to get out. They obviously were products of the Chinese school system and Chinese culture. Were you hesitant at all that you were going to put your child in the situation like your parents were in?
Absolutely. It's funny. I think that I was swayed in the way that every parent is swayed. Do you have kids, by the way?
Yes, we have 5.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. But you know how when you sort of move to a new community and everyone is talking about this one school, the wait list is a mile long, and you walk by and it's gorgeous and the building is beautiful and there's a sparkling green lawn and the playground equipment is updated. And you make these decisions not really based on any kind of real information or research. It's just that if everybody wants to go there, it must be a good experience. And that was kind of how it happened for us. Everybody wanted to go to this school. And it sort of colors your opinion. When you actually start asking around, why is it a good school? Nobody knows. They just know that everybody wants to go there, so it must be good. And, parenting is a lot like that. It's sort of fear-based, and it's sort of driven by, you covet something because everybody else covets it. It's not always rational. And that's kind of how we really jumped into the situation.
American or Western culture and civilization really values and promotes the idea of the individual. And, our own individual feelings matter the most. Our own individual expression is the most important. Did you find that, because you were raised in Houston, in a very American city and, in a very American way, did you feel that clash with the values you were raised with? And were you worried, about your son being brought up the opposite way?
That's a great question. And the reason I have faith in the individual spirit is because my father, God bless him, and we have a great relationship today, but he tried so hard to mold me into what he wanted. He wanted me to be a dutiful engineer who went to Stanford, and then here I am, an author, right? He was never able to clamp down in a way that he wanted. And so when I look at my own son, and he's a really rambunctious and a spirited child, I just didn't think that you can permanently quash that individuality. And when these other Chinese kids that I follow for the book, this in the same way, I would say they were sort of beaten down by the system. And frankly, you don't want to stay in the Chinese system for too long, but they have this great individual spirit too. And so, I had this great belief in humanity, and my dad couldn't do what he wanted to do with me in my career. And I just thought my son would be okay. So.
Yeah. You've mentioned a couple of times the other characters in the book, and the book is not just about your son. But how did you find these other characters, and how did you weave them into the narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question. One I was introduced to. A lot of these Chinese high school students, they really wanted to meet foreigners, just to sort of broaden their worldview. And in the same way, I was looking to meet Chinese students, and friends really put us together. And then I interviewed a bunch, and then 2 of them really wanted to stay in touch. And then I realized they're so interesting because they have secrets. One of them, his name is Darcy, and he looked like he was a perfect kid from the outside. Even his bangs were perfect. He was the top scorer in math. His hair was always perfect. He always had, a different pair of Nikes or Adidas on. And he was asked to join the Communist Party when he was 18, which is unusual for a high school student. Usually you don't join until you're in college. But, you know, he had secrets. He had a secret girlfriend. He had a secret mobile phone his father didn't know about. His parents, because they wanted him to study, they actually glopped glue. Imagine this. They glopped glue all over the television button so he couldn't turn it on. They hid the remote. But for 7 years, he knew where his parent had hidden the remote. It was behind the toilet commode in the bathroom. So they would leave the house and he would secretly watch television and they never knew, you know. And so this kid just intrigued me because he almost had two different lives, you know. And he could write essays about Communist Party propaganda and walking down the red road. But then privately he would say, this is all bullshit. This is all propaganda. I really just want to go to the University of Michigan. And, you know, to me, it was just, he was fascinating, you know, and spending time with him. And the other girl, Amanda, as well, sort of invited me into her private life, you know, and she was doing everything right on the outside, but she manages to eject from the system in a way that Darcy didn't. And she's now studying in the U.S. and doing really well. But I just love this idea, exploring the difference between public and private, you know. Yeah. And so China's a very complicated place, and so are these kids, you know.
We know that brings up a great question for me, and in following someone like Darcy, who can toe the party line, if you will, publicly, but on the inside really just wants to go do something else. Like, what kind of feeling and sense do you get from the average citizen? And I know that's there's no such thing as an average citizen. But, you know, what are the sentiments of the population there? Do you feel like that the Communist Party is still as powerful as it once was, or are sentiments changing?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah. Is there a sense of where the society is going?
So, you know, there's more information than ever before. The Chinese are traveling like you have not before. And so this is a great example. This year, they rewrote all the textbooks to play up, you know, Chinese hatred of the Japanese. So there's a second Sino-Japanese conflict, and they've decided to lengthen it to 14 years instead of 8. All the textbooks used to say it was only 8 years long, and they've lengthened it and pegged it to the 1931 Japanese Imperial Army's invasion of Manchuria. And the idea is we're going to hate Japan even more. But I talked to Chinese students. They're like, hey, I went to Tokyo. I looked around and I didn't see the Japanese devils my government is telling me to see. And I actually kind of like sushi, you know, and they come back to Shanghai and they tell me this. And so there's this conflict between what their government is telling them and what they see happening in the real world. And that is going to be a problem. And in some sense, it's causing this sort of, I would say, fear. You know, the party is clamping down like never before on dissidents, on censorship in the classroom, on banning topics of discussion. And I think, you know, it's troubling, but at the same time, it's almost like the lid's already been opened. It's too late for them to pop that back down again. I would think so. What role has the internet played in China's progression and the way people think? Is there first off, is the internet open? How much government control is there? You know, they try. So, you know, Western media, Facebook, the New York Times, Twitter, a lot of these things are sort of blocked in China. And there's something called the virtual proxy network you can use to get around that and access Facebook. But there are Facebook equivalents in China where there's a lot of information being spread. You know, there's Weibo, there's all kinds of things that the Chinese are using to spread information. And censorship is not, it's pretty bad. But what I've learned is that you can say almost anything on these social media platforms, but you cannot organize in a way that challenges the party. You cannot organize a public gathering. So that's really what they're most afraid of, is some kind of revolt, some kind of public protest. And those will be censored immediately. But other than that, you can talk about corruption. And so, you know, it's kind of interesting to see how that's going to develop over the next few years.
Yeah, and it's once ideas start spreading, that's something you can't keep a lid on.
Yes.
You know, propaganda can only go so far once people start to understand things, and
Let's hope.
Let's hope. Lenora, what can we as Americans, because more than half of the listeners to the show are in America or most Western countries, what can we learn from what you've experienced in China? What can we bring that will give us insight into the great things that they're achieving, and what can we bring to the way we do things?
I just think that I love the way the Chinese respect their teachers. Teacher Chen, obviously I had some problems with, but the overarching lesson was that she wanted respect from me and from my kid. And she said, when you challenge me in public, the kids pick up on that. They feel that they can challenge me too. And, it's kind of a good point. And I talked to American teachers in, 4 states for research for this book. And they're saying, Lenora, that's interesting because, not only my students are challenging me, but my parents too. They're not letting me talk to their kids in a way that I'd like to talk to them. If I assign a C, they ask me whether it should be an A. And I think American teachers feel beleaguered in a way that they were not a generation ago. And in China, you generally don't have that problem. Culture assigns them a social status on par with doctors, and that, right? And they're no need to be well paid to keep their social status. Not only that, it brings people into the profession. And in the U.S., we're having trouble recruiting teachers. So I think that's one of those things, is really need to respect the profession. And secondly, hey, kids are really resilient, and they are capable of learning difficult subjects from an early age. I think if we just trust our kids more, that they can do it. That was another thing that was kind of a narrative in the book. My son was much more resilient and less anxiety ridden than I was as a parent. So he taught me a few things.
I can imagine. The book is fascinating, Lenora. I did not know what to expect when I first picked it up. But I'm telling you, it was one of the most engaging reads that I've dug into in quite a while. So kudos.
Thanks, Hank. Are you sure you don't say that to everybody? I'm going to go check.
I promise I don't. I promise. I mean, but it was fantastic.
Thank you.
So, what is up next for you? I mean, after tackling a subject like this, kind of where do you go from there?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm trying. There's so many offshoots. I mean, I could parenting or education, or I could do more China. I'm just trying to figure out. I think I'll probably spend the next 6 to 8 months continuing to promote the book, hopefully, and try to get it out there. And there's a lot of essay writing around a book like this, trying to stay in the news, trying to stay in bookstores. So I think I'll be busy with that, and then we'll see where it leads me. I wish I knew the answer. Do you have any answers from me, Hank?
Don't we all? No.
I mean, you've been through this. It's like birthing a child 5 times, right? And all of a sudden the baby's here, and all the lead up is it's here. Now what? Not sure.
My wife laughs at me all the time because with every one of our kids, when we're at the hospital, I'm like, do we have to go home? I don't know what I'm going to do when we actually get home with this baby. I'm kind of terrified, Then when you get home, everything's great, but that, it's a lot similar with writing. I totally
exactly.
Get it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Lenora, if people are intrigued by your story and by the book, where can they find you to kind of follow along with your career and what's going on with you?
Oh, sure. My website, lenorachu.com. And I love to hear from people. So if anybody has questions, and people have been writing in, and it's been really great to engage in that way. Or follow me on Twitter at Lenora Chu, or Facebook, Lenora Chu Writer.
Awesome. Lenora, thank you so much for time to come on the show.
Thanks, Hank.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Joey's car was rust red with 4 patches of exposed steel on the roof. Joey said it was a beetle, and Jason said it looked more like a ladybug. Joey had protested and fumed, but the name stuck. Joey steered Ladybug toward Gorybrook Road, but a crowd of people blocked the intersection at Broadway. "Oh, damn," said Joey. "Was that today?" "What?" "The Halloween 8K. The joggers carried a banner with a logo of the horseman galloping and the words, "You better run." They were old, young, fat, skinny, and each one wore a Halloween costume. Batmen, Spider-Men, witches, vampires, fairies, skeletons, and little orphan Annie trotted past. A fat werewolf sweated silver bullets. A middle-aged Dorothy wiped her brow with a terry-cloth Toto. A little girl in a green tyrannosaur costume stopped to growl at the onlookers. Now this is Halloween, thought Jason Crane. Grab a costume and hit the streets. He felt gripped by the Halloween spirit. It rose from the coffin where it slept and bit him hard. This happened every October, a week before Halloween, when pumpkins lit the porches, when homeowners strung cobwebs, when the wind turned cold and worried the leaves. Something would catch him. The sight of a fright mask in the drugstore's seasonal aisle, $9.95 clearance hanging on prongs through its eye holes, or black and orange crepe, party plates, door decorations, bags of bite-sized Snickers or peanut butter cups or mini boxes of Milk Duds. Sometimes the trigger would be the first playing of the Monster Mash on local radio, or Night on Bald Mountain, or Totentons. Sometimes it would be the sight of a TV schedule packed with The Night of the Living Dead and Scream and My Bloody Valentine and Friday the 13th, or even Abbott and Costello Meet the Wolfman. This year it was the little tyrannosaur sitting on the balustrade of the Headless Horseman Bridge, kicking her feet while her mother adjusted a sports bra. This was childhood. It's Halloween, Jason realized, as if the idea were utterly new. Not a Halloween of gore and dangling eyeballs either, not for jaded adults. This was a Halloween for that little girl, brewed from fear of the dark and bumps in the night. We'll have to drive around, Joey said as the 8K grew denser. Good, said Jason. I'm not ready to go home yet. The little girl skipped away. Jason smiled for no good reason, except he was 16 and it was time to have fun.